Warning: the following audio story contains adult themes, sexual references, scenes of horror, and explicit language. It is not recommended for anyone under the age of 15.
GPS. Some places are best left unmapped. Part 1.
A white Ford Laser drove down a suburban tree-lined street with music blasting through crappy speakers. You know what you do in that situation? You just strip off all your clothes and smear yourself with shit, said Rihan Khan, who was sitting in the front passenger seat. Fuck, Rihan. Why would I want to do that? Said Barry Glidden, without taking his eye off the road. Well, said Rihan, the guy attacking you just thinks you're batshit crazy, and he won't come near you. Barry shook his head, grinning. Yeah, great, Rihan. Let me know how that works out for you. They pulled up outside a white three-bedroom house just before reaching the end of the street. Has he replied yet? Asked Barry, looking over at Rihan checking his phone. Nah, said Rihan. Just then, the fly screen of the front door flew open, and their friend Mark McHugh came running down the stairs with a sandwich stuffed in his mouth. He ran across the front yard, jerked open the back door of the Laser, and jumped in, and threw his jumper into the window space above the back seat. Gross earth, said Rihan, leaning over to bump knuckles with him. Mark looked at the two of them, his red hair still wet from the shower. Fuck man, you guys are just lucky that I'm here. My olds almost weren't going to let me come. How come, said Barry? 'Cause of bloody Grace. She got busted sneaking in with her boyfriend last night, and now they're cracking the shits about everything. Really? Rihan smirked. How is Grace? Rihan, didn't you hear the boyfriend part? They're probably out fucking somewhere last night. It was an unkind remark, but still wasn't enough to wipe the grin off Rihan's face. Grace was Mark's very attractive older sister. She had light blue eyes and a perfect blonde bob. Rihan had once almost caught her sunbaking topless when he had come round to visit Mark, though she had expertly covered up in the nick of time, having heard him coming in through the side gate. But she had still cheekily smiled at him and said hello, and that was all it had taken to spark Rihan's endless infatuation with her. So what'd you get? Asked Barry. Mark ceremoniously reached into his khaki border guard's jacket and pulled out a large blue glass bottle of Bombay Sapphire gin. Rihan coughed. Yuck, I hate that shit. Well, you don't have to drink it, said Mark. More for me and Barry. Surveying the size of the bottle, Barry asked, won't your parents notice that's gone? No, I don't think so, said Mark. Someone gave it to them as a duty-free present, but they don't really like gin. Good stuff then, said Barry. It beats Rihan's cask of wine, he laughed. Mark's face lit up. Is that what Rihan brought? Ha! Hey, fuck you, Mark. You know my parents don't drink. They just keep it in the house for when your mum comes to visit. Ah, hilarious, Rihan. You're such a funny bastard. Knock it off, you two, said Barry. Yeah, Mark, said Rihan. We got a party to get to. Barry looked in the mirror. What's the address, Q-boy? Hold on. Mark brought up the text that Sandra Claymore had sent him. It's 8 Hodson Street, Brightonley Sands. Hodson Street, how do you spell that? H-O-T-S-O-N. Barry started typing that into his phone's GPS, but just before being able to complete it, the autocorrect brought up the words hot sex. Something he immediately felt embarrassed by, remembering under what circumstances he had typed it into his phone the night before. He quickly tried to delete it, but accidentally hit the enter button. To his surprise, the GPS began to tick over, and then a location appeared. Barry plucked the phone from the holder on the dashboard to have a closer look. It was about 5 kilometres away, Gardenia, an industrial area where he had once gone to get his wipers fixed. Guys. What? Look what I just typed into my phone. He handed Mark the phone. Straight away, Mark asked, why are you looking up porn? I wasn't. The autocorrect brought that up. Yeah, but someone had to teach it that. Bloody hell, Mark, I know that. But don't worry about that. Just look at the fucking location. Mark studied the map, the light from the screen giving his face a blue, eerie glow. After a moment, he said, It's Gardenia. Yeah, said Barry. Rihan snatched the phone from Mark. Really? Is that what just came up? When you typed in hot sex? I was trying to put in the party address, said Barry. Rihan laughed. Well, what the fuck are we waiting for? Let's go have a look. What? No, said Barry forcefully. The magnetic image of Carly Nichols in her yellow bikini had been splashing around in his mind all day. I'm going to the party, he said stubbornly. We will, said Rehan, but let's just go have a look first. Barry shook his head. Come on, man, said Rehan suddenly, with an excited, slightly manic look on his face. Don't be such a soft cock. How often does shit like this happen? Hardly ever. The car was quiet for a moment. It's on the way, said a soft voice. Mark, you fucking traitor. All right, fuck the both of you. We'll go have a look, but if it's anything weird like a brothel, I'm pissing off straight away. Go on, Baz, said Rehan and patted Barry on the shoulder. You won't regret it. Yeah, sure I won't, Rehan. As they drove off, Mark in the back seat glanced back at his house through the window, at the streetlights turning on and the trees zipping away in neat pairs. They drove down to Parramatta Road, past the car yard where Barry had bought his car, turning left onto James Roos Drive. Flying up to the bridge over the Parramatta River, they got to see the sun in the west, going down over the blue mountains like a broken ball of molten steel. Coming down on the other side of the bridge, they stopped momentarily at the lights near Hooters, before flying off once more towards the Sandstone University, where students finished for the day walked across the front lawn up towards a brightly lit bus stop on Pennant Hills Road. The boys passed all of this, going over one more bridge, this time crossing a railway line.
In 100 meters, turn left onto Railway Parade.
Barry indicated to go left, and then looped sharply under the bridge, like a sudden turn on a roller coaster, the road straightening up to travel alongside the railway line down below. Where's this? Asked Rehan. Gardenia, said Barry. There was a train station, but no one was on the platform. Garbage spilled out of the bins, along the path to the shuttered-up ticket office, over which flickered a white fluorescent light. They drove past a closed cafe, past a strip of shops, continuing down a street that seemed to get darker as they went along. This is the sort of place you get stabbed, said Mark. Rehan let out a single snort through his nose, the way a film snob might laugh at someone's more sentimental choice of film. This particular laugh of Rehan's had always annoyed the piss out of Barry. What, Rehan? Just fucking say it. Why the fuck would anyone want to stab us? People do, said Mark defensively. Sometimes they just don't like the look of you, and that's enough. A look of scorn spread across Rehan's face. Yeah, and would anyone risk going to jail just to stab a couple of random dickheads? Maybe, said Mark. You never know. Rehan smirked, and opened his mouth to say something more, but then closed it, perhaps deciding he'd said enough. And Barry was pleased. Sometimes Rehan could be a real judgmental prick. He was actually very smart. He'd done way better than the both of them in their final year exams. But he also thought that he was some kind of gangster, just because he'd grown up in the western suburbs. But they all had, and they'd all had terrible things happen to them. And in this respect, Rehan was not unique.
Turn left at the approaching T-junction.
Hand over hand on the steering wheel, Barry made a hairpin turn, driving past a locked-up wreckers with a pink fluoro engine mounted over a padlock gate.
In 50 meters you will have reached your destination.
Mark leaned forward in the gap between the two seats. I can't see anything. Good then, said Barry. We'll just keep going. No way, man, said Rehan. I want to check this shit out. What about Grace? Stirred Barry. What would she say about all of this? Barry smirked. It wasn't often he had one over Rehan. Well, I'm just curious, he said, after a moment of guilty silence. I'm curious why your GPS would be bringing something like this up. Well, maybe dropping it last week has fucked it up permanently, but the guy at the shop said it was fixed. Yeah, that shouldn't affect an app, said Mark, who was planning to study engineering. That's more of a hardware problem. Well, I don't know, said Barry. But as they rolled slowly forward, past another shuttered-up takeaway and a parts distribution warehouse, a white two-storey terrace came into view, with a string of blinking lights along the second-floor veranda. It was the kind of Victorian terrace that you found in the trendy inner city, and it looked terribly out of place here, sandwiched between these dark and grimy warehouses. Bloody hell, said Barry. That is a brothel. No, it's not, said Rehan. It is, said Barry. They always have those kind of cheap-ass lights out the front. Then how come the front door's open, said Rehan. Wouldn't they have a locked grille for security? He's right, said Mark, pointing at the front door. They'd also have a security camera, so they can blackmail people later on. Barry was distracted by the thought of David Grogan plying Carly Nichols with Bacardi breezes. Well, I don't really care either way, said Barry. He was about to drop the handbrake when he felt Rehan's hand on his arm. Hold on, Barry. Let me and Mark go in and have a look first. Why? Said Barry in exasperation. He shook his head. Okay, go and have a look. But seriously, if you guys aren't back in 5 minutes, that's it, I'm fucking going. They both looked at him, and he added, Seriously, I'm not joking. Rehan already had his door opened. Great. Thanks, man. We'll be careful, said Mark, getting out as well. He had a swig of his gin and passed it back through the window to Barry, then caught up with Rehan on the stairs. Barry watched his two friends climb up to the porch, go in through the front door before disappearing around the corner. Barry locked the doors, then dropped his seat back a few notches. It wasn't a brothel, or at least they didn't think so. But it wasn't someone's house either. The place was just too strange. For instance, that first corner they took led to a large room with a high ceiling and a giant wall-length mirror. The mirror threw back a reflection of the two boys looking bewildered. And not that the boys were to know this, but no brothel would have a mirror like that in its foyer. It was just too shaming for the customers. Surrounding the mirror and running along the main three walls was a red velvet curtain. Along the window wall, the only one without the curtain, were 5 elegant single chairs with plush red upholstering. With no reception desk or anything like it, the only option for the two boys was to sit down, which they did. Suddenly thinking that someone might be watching them, Mark nervously scanned the room for a camera, but there was none, at least not one that he could see. Do you think someone's going to come out? Asked Mark. I don't know, said Rehan, with a surprising uncertainty. There's nowhere for them to come out from. Just then Mark noticed a split in the curtain on the wall directly in front of him. Look, he said, pointing it out to Rehan. That must be where the door is, but it's covered up. Rehan got up to have a look. He pulled the curtain back, and sure enough, it was an open doorway. Rehan gestured for Mark to join him. Mark looked hesitant, but he still stood up and walked over to him. This is nothing like a brothel. How would you know, said Rehan. You've never been to one before. I know, said Mark, but it wouldn't be like this. Rehan said, Well, we're not going to know unless we have a look. He stepped through the gap in the curtain, holding it up for Mark to follow. Mark shook his head and walked through, grabbing the curtain for himself. As he let it fall down behind him, it left a red mark on his hand, but it was too dark for him to see it. Both Mark and Rehan brought out their phones, lighting the corridor with the LED. It was a normal-looking hallway, except that it belonged to a house that was much older than what either of them were used to. On the left side were 3 closed doors, and towards the end of the corridor, an open room on their right, with a very faint light blinking out of it. Beyond that, they couldn't see anything. There were no sounds either. Nothing that sounded like hot sex. Nothing that sounded like cold sex. And at a certain level, the boys felt badly disappointed. Rehan took the lead, and as they crept down the hall, Mark began to worry that someone might suddenly jump out from behind one of the closed doors and drag them in. But the room stayed still and closed. They reached the end of the corridor, and Rehan waved his phone into the open doorway to see a small kitchenette, the unset clock of a microwave blinking 4 blue zeros. Next to the microwave was a white electric kettle, a small jar of Nescafe, and a glass bowl with 3 cockroaches sitting on top, nibbling at a pile of sugar crystals. Hey, fancy a coffee? No thanks, Rehan. The corridor continued for another metre, before opening up into a large black room with a shiny polished timber floor. On the back wall, a row of windows looked out over a Hills Hoist washing line with an assortment of bras and undies flapping in the breeze. At the far left of the room, there was another door, and this one had a sliver of light coming out from underneath it. Rihan whispered, "Signs of life." "Great," said Mark. "So we can go now." "Not yet," said Rihan. He turned off his phone and slid it back into his pocket. Too scared to voice a complaint, Mark reluctantly followed his friend across the room. A floorboard creaked under his foot, and his heart froze. Rihan shot him a dirty look. The light coming out from beneath the door wasn't exactly white or yellow, but a sickly orange, like the guts of a discarded pumpkin. Now they began to hear what sounded like sexual activity, something that sounded like a long groan, but it was so low that neither Rihan or Mark could be exactly sure that they had actually heard it. But as they came nearer to the door, they heard it again. In fact, they could hear lots of sounds now. The murmuring of people and music. Something about the music was frightening. It was like dance music, but there was something evil beneath it, like the chords were in decay, or something like that. Mark summoned the courage to say, "Okay, that's it, Rihan. Let's go. Hold on a minute. No, come on, man. You fucking promised." And then Mark watched, unable to move, his arms and legs trembling so badly from fear, as Rihan crept towards the door, and Mark instinctively knew that there was going to be something terrible behind it. There was another long moan, and Rihan saw his chance. Under the cover of this terrible noise, Rihan reached out for the handle. "Who the fuck are you? Rihan, run!" A bar of orange light fell across Mark's face, blinding him suddenly as his ears filled with the scream of his friend, and he suddenly felt himself flying towards the floor, hitting the timber to roll onto his back and see out of the corner of his eye Rihan upside down, sprinting away from him. Rihan ran as fast as he could, down the long corridor, through the dusty curtain, into the weird reception room, and then flying out through the front door, just as Mark had earlier that evening, but with no sandwich to stuff in his mouth, no comforting jumper from Mum, only a door handle to grab hold of, and then he would be safe. Barry was suddenly startled to see Rihan at the passenger side of the laser, shaking the shit out of the handle. "Barry! Barry! Open up, Barry!" Barry sat up quickly, reached over and flipped up the knob. Rihan ripped the door open, jumped in and pulled the door shut, so hard that a cloud of rust rained down within the interior of the door. "Go!" he shouted. "What? No. Where's Mark?" "Please go!" Rihan pleaded. "Where's Mark, Rihan? I'm not going without him. Please, please go. He's fucked." Rihan was almost crying. Barry had never seen someone so scared before. "Okay," he said, reluctantly starting the ignition. "Get your seatbelt on, we'll go." Barry put the car into drive and drove off down the street. About half a kilometre away from Gardenia, Barry suddenly pulled over to the side of the road and said, "Okay, Rihan, what the fuck happened?" Rihan had slid right down in his seat, with his legs awkwardly squashed up beneath the dashboard. "Come on, Rihan. If something bad has happened to Mark, then you need to tell me." Rihan peered over the dashboard to see if anyone was walking around outside. Barry angrily stamped his foot down. "Fuck, Rihan. This is your fault. You're the bloody one who wanted to go to this place." Rihan looked at him, and Barry could now see that he was shaking. Rihan looked as if he was trying to say something, but his bottom lip was trembling so badly that the words just fell out of his mouth. Barry sucked his breath in. "Look," he said, feeling around on the floor for Mark's bottle of gin. He found it, unscrewed the cap, and brought it up to Rihan's lips. "Have a drink of this," he said, tipping the bottle carefully back so that the gin could run freely into Rihan's mouth. Rihan began gulping at the gin. "Okay, that's enough." Barry recapped the bottle and put it down in the back seat. "Now please tell me what happened. It's important." The expression on Rihan's face had improved. It was less grim as the gin warmed him up. "Barry, it was the worst thing I've ever seen." "Really?" Rihan nodded. "I shouldn't have opened that door." "What door?" The door in the house. I shouldn't have opened it. Barry could see that Rehan was scouring over something in his mind's eye as a look of unbridled terror began to creep over his face again. Oh my God, I left Mark there. What have I done? Yes, you did, said Barry, but not unkindly. That's why you have to tell me everything that happened. What did you see there? There was these horrible women, and there was this man. He was in a cupboard. A look of disgust and horror crimped his normally handsome features. A cupboard? Barry almost laughed. Well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think he was in a cupboard. It was just horrible. Right, said Barry, it was horrible. I get it. Barry didn't know what to do. He could either go to the police or go back and get Mark, except now that option had become less appealing. Rehan's fear was rubbing off on him. Now he too was beginning to feel afraid, though going back was definitely the right thing to do. Just then, his phone blinked. He grabbed it, thinking that it could be a message from Mark. But Barry's stomach sank. It was a notification from his GPS. He clicked it open, starting the GPS up again.
At the third intersection, turn right.
The fuck? Said Barry. The GPS was directing him out of where they were parked, back onto the main road, but he hadn't even entered anywhere for it to go. Maybe it was just guiding him back home from an old route he had put in before. He drew in a deep breath and clipped his phone back into its holder. Put your belt on, said Barry. We're going. Rehan's eyes filled with panic. Not back to the house. No, said Barry, taking a breath. It was probably not the right thing to do, but Rehan looked greatly relieved, sliding back down into his seat. Barry again dropped the handbrake and put his car into gear, heading back to James Roos Drive. As he drove back over the bridge, there was an anger creeping up in him for having left Mark behind. Bloody Rehan, he thought. But it was not just Rehan's fault. It was his fault too. He could have locked Rehan in the car back at Gardenia and gone into the house to have a look for Mark himself. Anyway, there was nothing he could do about it now.
At the end of James Roos Drive, turn left.
Left, thought Barry. That's not the way home. But still, he found himself indicating to go in that direction. The lights changed to green, and he and a couple of other cars turned onto Parramatta Road. He passed a 7-Eleven, a Bunnings, and the front office for a concrete works. The GPS beeped to let him know that there was a speed camera ahead. Dropping down to just below 60, Barry looked over at Rehan, who was staring blankly out the window, fidgeting with the string of his hoodie. Barry continued along Parramatta Road, heading towards the city. Well, at least there's a police station in this direction, he thought. But what was he going to tell them? He and Rehan were 18, but Mark wasn't. So of course they would call his parents, and there would be a big shit fight. They'd all be in trouble.
Turn left at Russell Road.
Okay, well, fuck it. Now I officially don't know where the GPS is taking me, thought Barry. Looking away from the road, he tried to zoom the view of his GPS out, but it was stubbornly clinging to a street-by-street basis. Just then he heard the sound of a gin cap spinning. Hey Rehan, you okay? Yes. Barry drove over a bridge that crossed the main railway, taking him back into Auburn.
Take the second exit at the approaching roundabout.
Now, the streetlights were beginning to thin again, and they were entering into another industrial area, slightly different from Gardenia in that it was more of a freight distribution area, with warehouses and large business buildings, some of which had been converted into Chinese and Korean churches. He could have easily have turned around and gone home. Physically, there was nothing to stop him, but it was a feeling in his arms and in his heart that just compelled him to keep going. Like an unseen hand was guiding him, and he wasn't really sure why, but he kept listening and taking the turns like water pulled along a pipe, just waiting for somewhere to come out.
Turn left in 100 meters.
There was nowhere to turn left into. They had just been driving along a cyclone fence with a golf course behind it. As they closed in on the 100 metres, Barry flicked on his high beams and could see that the road did in fact turn into a shallow driveway, arcing in front of a massive steel gate. Barry pulled into the driveway, his wheels biting into the gravel. Rehan had snapped out of his mental cloud and was now sitting upright in his seat, looking wide-eyed out the window like a little kid. "Where are we?" he asked. "At a golf course," said Barry. "Golf course?" He looked around vigorously. "This is not a golf course. This is a cemetery." "How's it a cemetery?" "It just is, all right. My uncle is buried here." And sure enough, Barry looked up and saw the sign, Haslam's Creek Cemetery. Shit. He opened his door to have a proper look. "Where are you going?" "I was just going to look at the sign." "Don't." Barry sat back in his seat for a moment and pulled the door partially in again. "Look, Rehan, this is where the GPS has brought us. You're the one that said we should check it out. I know it's totally fucked up and weird, but we should at least have a look." "Why?" said Rehan. "Well, I don't really know," said Barry, "but in a way I feel like it's going to help us." "How the fuck's it going to help us?" said Rehan, with an unusual viciousness in his voice. "Hey, settle down." "No, why the fuck should I? You're just following this thing, not giving a shit, and it's brought us out of the fucking graveyard." Leaping to Barry's defense was an anger of his own. "Look, you're the fucking idiot who insisted we should follow it in the first place," he said. "I didn't even want to go to that house, and we should be at a fucking party now, not fucking creeping around like a couple of weirdos outside a fucking cemetery." Barry shivered and drew in a deep breath. "It's all right anyway," he said finally. "You're off the hook. It's closed." Then right on cue, the GPS said,
9, 2, 3, 7.
"What's that?" said Rehan. "I'm not sure," said Barry. "But Rehan, I'm getting out to have a look now, so you better deal with that." Barry pushed the door back open and got out. He knew Rehan was watching him as he crossed through the headlights to the gate post on the passenger's side. In his mind's eye, he could see the frightened look on Rehan's face, and something nasty in him smirked. "Who's the soft cock now, Rehan?" Barry's heart froze with horror as his mind scanned over that thought, wondering desperately where it had come from. But realizing that he wouldn't be able to get an answer, he turned his attention instead to the keypad on the sandstone gatepost, typing in the numbers the GPS had given him. 9, 4, 3, 7. He then pressed the little key symbol. Barry heard a mechanical whir, and the gate began to retreat sideways into a cluster of shrubs. The headlights gradually fell away from the metal gate onto the newly revealed road.
End of Side 1. Please turn over to Side 2.